holds in our heritage. Our founders expected that Christianity and no other religion would receive support from the government as long as that support did not violate people's consciences and their right to worship. They would have found utterly incredible the idea that all religions, including paganism, be treated with equal deference. Now, as I write in the book, I think that Thomas Jefferson would have found this quote itself incredible because, Thomas Jefferson's statute, his religious freedom statute in Virginia, the basis for the First Amendment, was very, very explicit that it actually was interested in extending its freedoms and protections to pagans and infidels, as well as every other denomination. And this is something that Jefferson wrote in his autobiography when he talked about how somebody had wanted to insert a reference to Jesus Christ into the Virginia statute on, into the Virginia statute on religious liberty, and he wrote that the reference to Jesus Christ was rejected by the great majority in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. And what I find kind of saddest about this movement is that somebody like Thomas Jefferson could never be elected president today when kind of being an Orthodox believer is a kind of litmus test, in many cases for both parties. So anyway, this kind of idea of Christian nationalism has been diffused and now forms almost the kind of political atmosphere in many parts of the country where the movement is strongest. And so you've seen a kind of systematic effort, and not an illegitimate effort, I should say. I mean, people have the right to organize, and the sad fact of this for people who disagree with their agenda is that they've simply out-organized their opponents. The movement, the movement has different antecedents in American history. We've seen kind of populist nationalist movements rise up from, time and again, from, the nativists to the silver shirts during the Depression. But I think that the most kind of direct genealogy for this movement starts, it has also some roots in the John Birch Society, but you can see it really starting in the late 70s with the creation of the moral majority. And the moral majority was created when 3 veterans of the Barry Goldwater campaign decided that they wanted to kind of use religious conservatism to split the Democratic Party. And so it was Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie, and Howard Phillips. And they decided that they were going to recruit this fairly obscure Baptist preacher named Jerry Falwell to start a religious organization that they could use as a kind of a wedge. So they founded the Moral Majority. The original board members included Tim LaHaye and D. James Kennedy, who I spoke about before. Now, the Moral Majority was a kind of national organization. They had rallies, they did mailings. What came after it was much more sophisticated, and that was the Christian Coalition, which was born about a decade later. It came out of the roots of Pat Robertson's failed presidential campaign. After that campaign, Pat Robertson found that he had a national grassroots infrastructure. They created the Christian Coalition, and the Christian Coalition has been very, very good at making this a local movement, at becoming precinct captains, at fighting school board races, at fighting town councils, at kind of Christianizing the Republic, at taking the Republican Party over from the grassroots up. And that's really what's happened. The Christian Coalition barely exists anymore. They've had their tax-exempt status revoked because of their political activities. It's really just a kind of shell of its former self. But other organizations have since been born that have capitalized on the infrastructure that it's built and that created this very, very sophisticated political machine. And again, I have to say, this is a political machine in many ways more than it is a religious one. A Baptist preacher, a kind of old-school Baptist preacher who still believes in separation of church and state, who I met in East Texas, said to me once, the people who lead this movement will cross any denominational line for politics, but they'll never cross political lines, to stand in solidarity with other people of their denominations. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that this has gradually become almost indistinguishable from the Republican Party. I was talking before about this revisionist Christian history. One of the biggest proponents of this revisionist history is a guy named David Barton. Now, David Barton in the early 90s, he has quite a radical past. In the early 90s, he spoke at 2 Christian identity conferences. And I don't know if you guys know what Christian identity is, but it is a very, very rabid right-wing sect that holds that black people are animals, that Jews are the children of Eve and the serpent. It's, you know, it's a religion of, you know, the kind of militia movement, you know, based in some of these compounds in the Northwest. So anyway, he spoke at 2 of these conferences in the early 90s with, you know, the leading Holocaust denier on one hand and the leading white supremacist on the other hand. A few years later, he went on to become the vice chairman of the Texas Republican Party. And he now says he didn't know what those conferences were. You know, he was just invited and he spoke. Anyway, he went on to become a very, very important figure in diffusing this idea that separation of church and state is a myth and that the founders intended a Christian nation and that it's the duty of politically engaged Christians to kind of reclaim the power that was stolen from them by secularists over the last 100 years, you know, who kind of perpetrated the fraud of separation. And the Texas Republican Party platform actually commits the party to fighting the, quote, myth of separation. So David Barton was, you know, he's been very active in politics in a number of ways, but in 2004, he was put on the staff of the Republican National Committee to travel the country organizing preachers, telling preachers that they should get their congregations involved in politics, that they should mobilize their congregations. What was happening in concert with this was networks of what are called patriot pastors, you know, people in various states organizing all of the pastors in their states to kind of transform their churches really into political machines. And that was helped a lot by Issue 1, or not Issue 1 in Ohio, but all of these anti-gay marriage initiatives. The important thing I think to realize about the anti-gay marriage initiatives is that whatever your stand, and there are, although I disagree with them, there are decent people who disagree with gay marriage. But that's not really what these initiatives have been about, for several reasons. I mean, first of all, because most of these initiatives, and there was 11 of them in 2004, and there's going to be more of them in 2006, are far more far-reaching than stripping gay people of the right to marry, a right that they never had to begin with in most of these states. They usually strip them, or in many cases they strip them of the rights to share health insurance, to adopt children, to make visiting arrangements when they're in the hospitals. They strip them really of rights that they've already had, and in many cases can really turn people's lives upside down. But they're very, very useful politically, both because they mobilize people. They allow, you know, as I write in the book, every populist movement needs an enemy. And it's very significant, I think, that Ken read this section about the kind of mutual antipathy of the Calvinists and the Catholics and how they managed to come together in persecution. Because, you know, traditionally, right-wing Protestants in America have spent a lot of time fighting Catholics. They wrote these kind of lurid books about the debaucheries of the convent and the kind of, you know, sexual perversity of Catholicism. You know, the historian Richard Hofstadter once wrote, anti-Catholicism is the pornography of the Puritan. But what we've seen in the last few years is that this, really starting with the issue of abortion, the Catholic right and the Protestant right have made common cause and have really set aside their antipathy. And then a little bit later, you saw a lot of kind of right-wing Protestants in the South work hard to make common cause with black churches that they had previously, you know, anathematized. And so even though there's still, you know, plenty of racism, there's also a real effort to reach out. You know, a lot of these anti-gay marriage rallies have actually doubled as what they call racial reconciliation rallies, you know, with black and white standing together